Alrighty, today we're going to be talking visuals. Now, effects is the next one in the list, but I'm actually going to skip that and go to doors. We'll go back to effects here in a second, but doors, also known as exits, are, well, just that, the exits of the plane. Now, unfortunately, you can only have 4 exits total, but the sim, you can assign exits to an animation. The sim won't recognize them as exits unless they're one of these 4, however. Now, the default caravan has only the first thing needed here. But there are actually 5 sets of numbers needed for an exit typically. The reason the default caravan doesn't have the other 4 is because it really doesn't need it. If we look at the caravan on the 3D model and slide the animation slider up, we can see the exits on it. So we have a pilot and a co-pilot door, a rear cargo door. You can tell it's a cargo door because it's located in the rear, and it's large. It's far larger than what you would need for passengers, so that's definitely a cargo door. And the passenger door on the right side, because it has stairs and smaller. So that's how we know. Now, the way you actually assign doors is done through the 3D model, actually. The doors are an animation, and they have to have a tag associated with them. Doors 0 through 3. Door 0 is opened with Shift E and is considered the main passenger door by Flight Sim and most add-ons. In actuality, it can be any one of these doors because let's go through the different things. 0.4, which you can see here. This is the open and close rate of the door. If we go to aircraft configuration and then exits, you can see what you need. The value defines the number of simulated exits on the doors. The first one, like I said, open and close rate in percent per second. So when you push one of the key commands to open a door, it will open by 0.4% every second. The next set of numbers is the position data relative to the datum, longitudinal, lateral, vertical, just like before. This one's important if you want jetways and ground services to work. I know most people forget this now that things like GSX exist, but FSX actually had ground services and still has ground services when it came out. I will admit they're not as good as they could have been, but they certainly were not terrible. So, yeah. And the way they worked is you had to define the position of the exit in the CFG file so that the ground service vehicles knew where to go, particularly for the main exit or whatever you want the jetway to connect to, because the jetway looks for this position. If this is not there, the jetway will not work. And actually on AI Aircraft Editor, it even tells you can define 3 exits here: closure rate, longitudinal, lateral, vertical, and type. And it will tell you if jetway is possible or not. Obviously, it's not possible with the caravan because there's no need for a jetway to hook up to a caravan. But for larger aircraft, you do need to define the position of at least your Type 1 and, what was the other one? Type 0 and Type 1 exits. Because we'll get into types in a second, but those are the ones that are used by the sim for the ground service animation. Now, you might want to go ahead and define all of them for the end user, especially if they're using GSX, because GSX actually looks for these numbers too. Although, at least with GSX, they can make their own custom thing to map it out. So if you have GSX, and honestly, you really should if you're an aircraft maker, so you can make your own GSX INI file to go with it. This is a good place to start, is by positioning them correctly in the CFG file. That way you save time and effort when you have to make the INI file in GSX. Now the last number is the class of exit. Now Flight Sim lists 3 classes of exits here, but there's actually 4. 0 is a main exit. So if we wanted this fictional exit of ours that I've canceled out with the 2 slashes, if we wanted it to be the main aircraft exit, we'd make that 0 right there. Oops. Class 1 is a cargo exit. Now, 0 is where the jetway goes. Cargo is where the ground service vehicles go. And Type 2 is an emergency exit. The other type is Class 3, and that is just miscellaneous. Sim just knows it's an exit, but it's not really serving a purpose. So if you were to map the exits out properly on the default caravan, you would probably want to make this the main door. And the reason you would do that is because a lot of add-ons, chiefly like FS Passengers or FS Copilot, they look to see if the main door is open before they let you load or unload passengers. So it would make no sense if that was this door. Instead, you want to make it this door, since that's the one that people are going to get on and off of. You can make your pilot and co-pilot be miscellaneous doors, and this the cargo door. And that's how that works. Or you could make this the main, this the cargo, and these two emergencies, or maybe the co-pilots. There's any way we could do it, but when you decide which your main door is going to be, think about that. Think about, especially if you're designing the aircraft as a payware developer, don't think about how you use the plane. Think about how the end user is going to use the plane. Also keep in mind, you can't account for the end user having add-ons. The best way to do it is to actually just make it work for default setups, and the add-ons have to adapt to that. That's actually how it should be done, because you can never assume that an end user is going to have a particular add-on or not. You could recommend add-ons saying that, hey, this is set up for this in mind, or I highly recommend you have this add-on. I do that with my sceneries, but you can never assume that the end user actually has an add-on of any kind. So as an add-on developer, it's best to make sure your stuff works with default. And yeah, if everyone did that, the world would be a much better place. And that's exits. Okay, so let's talk effects. Earlier, I've been kind of throwing a few add-on devs under the bus throughout this video, saying that a lot of them don't seem to have read the SDK. Well, this effects section is the best proof of that, because look at this effects: wake, water, dirt, concrete, touchdown. This is a default plane. But if we randomly go to an add-on airplane's effects files, let's just say the Coronado Baron. If I Control F, effects, wake, water, dirt, concrete, touchdown, wake, water, dirt, concrete, touchdown. And you'll find that is repeated throughout several add-on devs airplanes. It seems they only ever do these effects, these 5: wake, water, dirt, concrete, and touchdown. Here's all the effects you can have. There's like 20 of them. Add-on devs, default. Now, I will admit, none of the default planes make use of all the extra effects either, but I would expect add-on devs to, especially if you're charging money. So you see, I have a reason for not trusting add-on devs, because a lot of them just don't make use of built-in features. So why the hell should I throw them away? Anyway, let's go through this. Hopefully more people start making use of this feature in the future when you see just how many effects it can have. Look at this, it's well over 20 here. We'll go through them in a second. But first, let's talk this. Basically, you have, sort of similar to the electrical system, you have a component or a particular property, in this case, wake, and that is the wake effect name. We should probably go for water, actually. It'd be more descriptive. So water, the property is water. The landing, taxiing, or taking off from water effect. So you see you see an example here. The default A321 has effects spray, water speed, traveling at speed on the water. You get it. It's different components, and then you specify the effects file that you want to play from the particular contact points. Contact points we'll get to next. But these are the effects files that will play from the contact points when certain conditions are met. The only other integers you got to put here is either a 1 or a 0 or nothing if you want it to be a single firing. So a single iteration. Like for example, the touchdown effect. The touchdown effect is usually followed by an optional 1 to indicate the effect is run only once. If you don't put that 1 after the touchdown effect, then the touchdown effect is going to run as long as the touchdown parameter is met, which would be any time the plane's on the ground. So you'll constantly see the plane leaving behind rubber skid marks. So you put that 1 there to indicate it only fires once. All right, so effects file, and then a 1, a comma space 1, if you only want it to fire once. Let's go through the different properties. Wake, we've already talked about, water and water speed. Dirt, moving on dirt. Concrete, moving on concrete. Touchdown, when you touch down. Contrail. This one really gets to me because the default contrail effect has some really, it needs work. But there's absolutely no reason why an add-on developer has to use it. Why has no one made their own custom contrail effect, or at least only a few people, and then put it in here with this? I mean, we're talking about devs who charge you money for their add-ons here, and they can't even do this. They can't even be bothered to do the basics. You see why yeah. Startup. This is the engine startup effect, sort of like a puff of smoke from the exhaust port of the engine, or actually it comes from the engine position. Land rotor wash. The rotor wash. This is for helicopters only. So if you see rotor wash, it's for choppers. You got 1 for land, 1 for water. Vapor trail for the left and right. That's the wingtip vapor trail. The wingtip vortice. The wingtip vortice contrails off the wingtip, usually from a jet such as an F-18. You got 1 for the left wingtip, 1 for the right wingtip. Fuel dump effect, engine fire effect, engine damage effect, engine oil leak, skid pavement. This is the skid on tarmac that leaves a mark. Snow ski track. So if you're running around on skis on the snow, it will leave a skid on the snow. Wheel snow spray, wheel wet spray, wet engine wash, similar to the water wash of a helicopter. The effect a propeller has on wet terrain when flying below 20 meters. Snow engine wash, water ballast drain. That applies to like if you have a water ballast system. Piston failure, if 1 or more pistons has failed. And the windshield rain effect available. Now, special note on this one. You can turn windshield rain effects on or off with the 0, but they seem to all be disabled for FSX aircraft unless re-enabled by the add-on dev. I haven't tried setting this to 1 on default planes to see if you can get a windshield rain effect coming back. I need to experiment with that, see if it works. But again, you can define your own custom effects with all of these. And so few add-on devs ever did. It's a damn shame. And they bothered, and they had the gall to charge money. Alright, so now we're going to talk landing gear. Now, landing gear. The things we're defining here are what's called contact points. This is all there is to the landing gear, is this section right here. So, I want to stress something real quick. This does not in any way define where the aircraft is going to rest on the ground. These only control information the sim needs to make the landing gear work, as well as where different effects that we discussed up here are going to be triggered or played from. The part that... You see these little red squares? These are the contact points right here. You find them basically any part of the plane that can contact the ground. That's where a contact point is going to be. So your wingtips, the tail, the prop, the tires, and for some reason the rudder too. Any part that would contact the ground, basically. Now, the 3D model is what controls the part of the plane that's actually going to be resting on the ground. However, you do want these to match up. And you can see in the model how they are pretty close. Pretty much right on them, maybe a few inches off. But for the most part, they're right on there. So the contact points looks like a long stream of numbers. It looks confusing as hell, but if you break it down, it actually begins to make some sense. So contact point 0. You can put as many contact points on the plane as you want. And you just number them accordingly. Usually the first 3 are going to be the landing gear. 9 times out of 10. Not always, so make sure you check. And the way you check is by looking at the first number. This is the class of the contact point. 0 is none. 1 is a wheel, so if it has a type of 1, then it's the landing gear if it has wheels. 2 is a scrape point, which is usually a wingtip or some other part of the plane that might hit the ground that's not a wheel. 3 is a skid point, which is used on planes with skis. 4 is a float, and that's used if the aircraft is equipped with floats. Now, be very, very aware. If you've ever downloaded a plane that has floats but for whatever reason won't land in the water, that's why they've set the contact point wrong. It needs to be a 1, or it needs to be a 4, not a 1. And 5 is a water rudder. That just defines the position of the water rudder. Now, the next 3 numbers is your position, longitudinal, lateral, vertical, just like before. This number is impact damage. So this number here, the first number after the position data, which is the 4th number, that's the impact damage. So for landing gear, if you touch down at a rate greater than this number, damage will occur. You'll trigger a crash if the crash detection is turned on, and add-ons can also read this. FS passengers will read the data from here to see what the touchdown rate is. The next one is the brake map, and this defines which brake is this particular contact point on if it's a wheel. 0 if there's no brakes, and that's where everything's going to be except wheels. You can see contact point 0 also has a 0 here. That's most likely our nose gear, and you can see it has no lateral deviation, so yeah, definitely our nose gear. Nose gear doesn't have brakes on this airplane, so it has a 0. The 1 is the left brake, and a 2 is the right brake. So make sure you set these up accordingly. This is obviously our left wheel. This is our right wheel. Now, this number here is the wheel radius. This number here is the steer angle. What is steering angle? Let me define that for you. Let's see. The maximum angle, positive and negative, that the wheel can pivot. So our steer angle, you see after our 0.5, I lost it for a second. Brake map, wheel radius, steer angle. So the center gear has 0 on it, so it can't steer. The main gear can pivot either 22 degrees either side of center. The static compression, 0.3. 0 if it's rigid, so fixed landing gear would be a 0 here. Now you can see we have 0.3 compression available for all landing gear on the Caravan. The max static compression ratio, 2.5 across all the landing gear, 0 for everything else. The dampening ratio, this comes more into play if you're taxiing across rough surfaces like grass, particularly non-runways. Airport surfaces, even if it's grass, they tend to be a little bit smoother in FSX, but definitely when you're going across non-airport surfaces, like say you made an off-airport landing, things get a lot bumpier. So this is the dampening of the bumps. This number here, the 3rd from the last one, is the extension time in seconds, and the one right after that is the retraction time in seconds, so you can have an extension and retraction time that takes 2 different amounts. Now, the last number is also important because this ties into the sound system. Now, we'll do another video talking about the sound files, at least talking about them. But this here controls what sound is going to play when that contact point contacts the ground. So, our center gear plays type 0, which is center gear. Our left gear and right gear is 2 and 3, so they can also have a contact point. 1 is the auxiliary gear, so you can have a 3rd landing gear essentially if you want, or a 4th one. A type 4 is a fuselage scrape. Type 5 is a left wing scrape. Type 6 is a right wing scrape. Type 7 is an auxiliary scrape. Actually, type 7, 8, and 9, or no, type 7 and 8 are the auxiliary scrapes. You can have 2 different ones. So and type 9 is a tail scrape. Now this controls the sounds because you can have a sound file for each and every one of these, meaning you can have a sound file that's different for the left landing gear than it is for the right one, or you could combine them into one file. It's completely up to you. So that is what allows you to have things like, say, a sound file only playing out of the left speaker if it's the left landing gear, right speaker if it's the right one. That's where you can control stuff like that. Max number of points functions pretty similarly to the max weight and balance stuff. Make sure it is at least equal to, if not more than, the number of contact points you've put in. The static pitch, this is the degrees pitch when the aircraft is at rest on the ground. A positive number is up, a minus number is down. You can see the aircraft naturally pitches up about 2 degrees when it's sitting on the ground. And the static CG height, the altitude of the CG when it rests on the ground. Now, this is not a datum reference thing here. This is how high the CG sits off the ground. So find your CG and measure to the ground. Alright, the next section we're going to go over is warning systems. These are various warning systems that the plane can have, and most of these were added for FSX, so you won't find them on FS9 aircraft. One of them was added for acceleration, so you won't find it on any aircraft prior to acceleration. So the first one we're going to go over is the stall warning. And this is a pretty simple one. You have a flag to set whether or not there is a stall warning and what type it is. So like before, it will default to a suction system if you don't specify it. So if you don't want the plane to have a stall warning, then you need to specify there is no stall warning with a 0. Type 1 is a suction type system, which is a little hole on the leading edge of the wing. The way stalls work, if you can imagine the top of the wing, center of lift on the wing, as the stall begins to occur, the center of lift moves further forward and forward and forward, and it's basically a vacuum. It's definitely lower pressure. And when it gets to this hole in the wing, it will pull the air from that hole out to the outside of the wing, and that activates a suction sound which can be heard in the cockpit. Or if it's an electrical one, a Type 2 system, if you have the A2A182, you could see this. There's basically a little flap on the wing, and when the center of lift gets too far forward, the low air pressure pulls that flap up, closes a circuit, activates a buzzer. So a suction type will work all the time. It's a passive system that works no matter what. An electric type, however, requires the main battery be on. Actually, is there any entry in the electrical system for the for that one? No. It might be one of those things that's tied to the additional system bus, but that's basically how that works. It needs electrical power to function. Now, stick shaker. This activates a stick shaker if a stall is approaching. This is commonly found on airliner aircraft as well as certain other jets, but this is a simple flag, set to 1 if the aircraft has a stick shaker. Now the next one is the gear warning system. This triggers a sound that plays. You can specify the sound in the sound file or the sound folder in its CFG file, but it triggers the sound when certain conditions are met to let the pilot know that there is no landing gear. The landing gear is not deployed or it's not locked. So the first one is just a flag set to 1. Actually, no, it's not. Okay. You set it to 0 if there is no gear warning system available. You set it to 1 if it is available. And you set it to 2 if it's an amphibian type aircraft, where it will warn you if the gear is up or if the gear is down. And it will actually say when you're approaching the landing, gears up for water landing, gear down for hard surface landing or whatever. So that's that number. The next number, these next 3 values actually all play in together. The first one is the throttle limit. Below this throttle limit, the gear warning will trigger and the sound is played. Let's see. Throttle limit below which the gear warning will activate if the gear is not down and locked while the flaps are deflected at at least to the setting for flap limit idle below. So flap limit idle we should probably go over first. This is the flap setting that is used in conjunction with the throttle limit specified above, that when it's at this setting and the throttle, if this is true, if the flaps are at the setting and the throttle is at or below the specified point here, the gear warning triggers. Now you can set this to 0 to have the gear warning trigger tied to the throttle 100%. And you would just put the flap deflection, I think the angle is what you'd put in here. Let's find out. Let's see, it'd be gear warning. By setting this limit to a greater value than 0, the pilot can reduce the throttle to idle without activating the warning, often utilizing jets to decelerate or descend the aircraft. Yeah, it appears to be in the flap deflection angle, which you entered in the flap section above. So if I find the flaps again, yeah, the deflection angle you entered here. So for a Caravan, it'd probably be right at 30, but a Caravan isn't going to have a gear warning system because it's fixed gear anyway. So there. And the flap limit power is basically the override. When the flaps are brought to this setting, the landing gear warning sounds regardless of the throttle point. Okay, again, so quick review because I know I made that a very confusing explanation. If this is set to 0, then this controls the gear warning. That's the throttle. Below the specified point, this will sound. And let me make sure. Throttle limit, percent throttle, 0.01. This is a scalar. These are scalars, by the way. So 1.0 is full throttle, and 0.1 is like 1% throttle. No, that'd be 10% throttle. And both of these need to be true unless this one is 0. This is the flap. You know what? I can't explain it. I'm just convinced I can't explain that. If these are true, it sounds. If this is true, it sounds, regardless of what the other two are. Moving on. Max warning. This is the GPWS, Ground Proximity Warning System, which was a new system with FSX. Unfortunately, it doesn't do all the things a GPWS actually does. Like, you don't get the wind shear warning. You don't get the altitude readouts verbally. But it does warn you things like sink rate. So this is the maximum height. This is the height below which the warnings can be activated. 2,500 feet usually works. This isn't above ground, by the way, because height specifies that is above the ground of the of wherever the plane is. Sink rate, if an aircraft exceeds this descent rate, the warning is activated. Now this one you want to be a high descent rate. You don't want this to be triggered during a normal descent. So if the normal descent rate is minus 2,000, probably set this to minus 3,000. If there is a maximum descent rate specified for the aircraft, then set this to like 100 feet above it, and that will let the pilot know he's going too fast. Excessive sink rate. If the aircraft exceeds this rate of descent, a more urgent warning is played. So you can have this one be your maximum. This one can be a ridiculous maximum, saying, hey, you are descending way too quickly. I believe that one is just sink rate, and this one triggers the sound that says don't sink. Okay, so if an aircraft starts to descend during takeoff and exceeds this rate of descent, a warning is activated. So this is the climb out sink rate feet per minute. You want this one to actually be low because on climb out takeoff, you don't want to descend at all. So setting that to minus 100, minus 200 is usually the best policy because you don't want it to descend when it's supposed to be taking off. So that should be a definite warning situation. Flap and gear sink rate feet per minute. If an aircraft is landing and exceeds this descent rate without flaps or gear extended, the warning is activated. So if you descend at a faster rate, let's say you put 1,000 feet per minute in here, if it's going to warn you if the gear and the flaps are not deployed. Pretty straightforward stuff there. Now, voice alerts. This applies mostly to fighter planes. The only default aircraft that uses this is the F-18. And this this will tell you, you got two voice alerts, either over G or low fuel. Now you can assign these to any airplane, by the way, so you can give any airplane a low fuel warning. Okay, so we got three values here: low fuel limit in percent, check above, check below, and check every seconds. So low fuel limit percent, what exactly is that? Let's see if it tells us more in the SDK. Wrong one. It should be voice alerts. No, it doesn't tell us anymore. Low fuel limit. Not quite sure what that is. It seems to be a scalar, so that's probably like 10%. So it'll warn you when you get down to 10%, regardless of what the other two settings are. Next we have check above or below. A positive number will be checking above, and a negative number is checking below. So I guess this probably specifies the point at which it will trigger, and this specifies whether you want it to trigger when it's above that or below that. Probably when it's below that. And then check every 60 seconds is just how often do you want the voice alert to check and see if the fuel is actually below that point. Over G limit, the high G limit, check above, check below, check every second. So this one, like above, is your limit, 6 Gs. That's pretty heavy. This is the play if it's above 6 Gs. This is the play below 6 Gs if it's a negative number. And 1 is check every second. So to explain this one, our limit is 6 Gs. We want it to play if we increase our G load above 6 Gs. And we want to do that every second. For low fuel, our limit is 10%. We want it to play if we're below that, and we want it to check every 60 seconds. So that's the warning systems. I probably made them sound a lot more difficult than they actually are. So I hope I got through clearly what goes here. Keep in mind, these can go to any airplane. You don't necessarily have to have them on a certain one. Though do use your head. You don't want a gear warning system on an airplane that's fixed gear, like our Caravan. But you can have different warnings for other airplanes. Now, a lot of these have sound files attached. They are in the sound folder. Doesn't appear to be a way to specify them in the sound folder of the aircraft, so they go in the main sound folder. It looks that way. I'll have to do some more reading and check. But those are the 4 warning systems you can have. And on to, I think, our last section. Yeah. And we'll be done with this video. So see you in a bit.